All right. I was watching the news this morning and they said that George Bush is going to run for Attorney General against Ken Paxton, who gets indicted every time he's Attorney General, which is fascinating to me. And then some horse got in trouble as well for cheating in a race. So there you go. That's all the news. Plus, it's going to rain. Yeah, the rain's kind of nice. Yeah, we had soccer tryouts last night. I run a little soccer league, and we had to cancel them because of lightning. Yeah. So somebody checked in, Jacob. Your last name is Young, yes?
Hello.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm right.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. I did start recording, and that's when I started talking about people's names. That's cool. Sorry, I got a couple more folks coming in, and then we'll try again. Okay. Oh, no. Goodness. I'm sorry if you got flooded and stuck somewhere. Now, if you live near a low water crossing, that is certainly a possibility. Yeah. Nope, it's fancy where I live, so I'm high enough. My husband used to teach at a high school that had enough water around it that occasionally, if it rained too much, they couldn't get in. It was really tragic. So, yeah, no, log is not probably the right place for the rain stuff. All right, we should talk about history, though, right? This rain might make history if it keeps it up. All right, so let's talk about the document assignment. As I said, we would talk about that today. And we'll finish, sorry for the giant yawn, talking about chapter 1. Maybe start chapter 2 a little. I don't want to go, too far into it because I know I told you probably didn't need to read that until next week or for next week. So, I don't want to spoil all the surprise or anything, but we may peek at it a little bit. So let's look at the document assignment questions. And, unless I decided I didn't like how I made the questions, they'll probably be the same for each document, just a different document each time. So let's look at the questions. I may rearrange them as what dang, what the heck is that all about? What is on your screen right now? Dang, let me go back, see if I can find you guys again. Craig, do you have like 4 documents on your screen? What the heck? How did that happen? Okay. Can you see the thing that says a short account of the destruction of the Indies, or do you see like 52 documents?
You see the word document, the short account.
Okay, thanks. All right. Okay. Yeah, each week, here's what you have to do by Friday. Each week, you'll have a question from the unit, which is either one of 3 or 4 chapters. In this instance, you have 4 chapters. So there's a question for each chapter, and you pick one of those questions. Please don't turn in all 4, turn in one question, okay? And you do the document question, which we're just about to talk about. Everybody will do the same document question. And then you'll have a quiz, which will have 25 questions, and they are multiple choice. Okay. So each unit has 3 things that you do. One question, you pick 1 out of 4. One document question, you all will have the same, it's a series of questions. And then a quiz, and the quiz will have 25 questions. Each of those assignments is worth 25 points, 25 points. So that means 75 points per unit, which is how we get to the 300 for the whole class. So there you go. That's all the math I have for you. So hopefully all of that is fairly clear. I know we went over it the first day, but not everybody was here the first day. And also maybe it didn't make sense or whatever. So it should be stated relatively clearly, I hope. in the syllabus. I went back and, corrected errors. There were a few, sorry, and reposted. And then hopefully there's a little more clarity in the assignment section, but you have a document question, a chapter question, and a quiz for each unit, okay? All right, so let's look at the document stuff. Excuse me. Oh, somebody's coming in. There we go. All right. All right, so here we go, document. All right, so we'll look at the document here in a second. That's a link to the entire online source. And I also really just intended you to read the part about Cuba, but you can read more if you like. So I think I posted a little more than I meant to. The document that I posted for you is 6 pages long, and I really sort of intended for it to be 2, but we'll look at that in just a minute. This is also why it's good to come to class and pay attention. So hopefully you'll find some value in that. And I may try to go back and edit the document a little bit, but I probably won't, because I know there was some intro stuff in there that I wanted you to have, and my ability to edit might make it worse. We'll see. So we'll read the excerpt here in a sec, and these are the questions you'll want to talk about. Who is the author of the document? And that'll be, of course, Bartolomé de las Casas, but you've got to tell me, like, what do you do for a living? Who was he? Why do we care about him? And the book talks about him a little bit too. And, if you, ouch, sorry. Sorry, if you, sorry, it's the little area where I had the little surgical procedure and I sort of knocked it against the chair. So that's why I'm making those faces. So, if you feel like you didn't get enough information in the book or in the document about De las Casas, of course you can look him up if you want to know more stuff about him. Always when you do that, make sure that you look at what seems to be a reliable source. I'm not even saying like Wikipedia is not your best source. It's probably not your best source. But a lot of times at the bottom of the Wikipedia article, there'll be some, resources. And if you look at those, a lot of those resources are fairly legit. But a lot of times the .edu resources are pretty good. History Channel is usually pretty good. I know there's some online encyclopedias and stuff, but they usually don't have quite enough information. Biography Channel is sometimes good. I don't know, or biography.com. I don't know if they have a thing on De las Casas. We should look, right? But okay. All right, so who's the author? What is their purpose in writing? And when you talk about who they are, also talk about what they do for a living. When was the document written? I was reading something this morning before class that there's some argument about whether it was written in 1491 or 1492, some of the stuff. And it's like, well, for our purposes, either one of those things will be okay. And where and who was the intended audience, and what type of document was it? Just an actual document, pamphlet, government issued document, newspaper article, diary entry, personal letter. How does this impact credibility? Because you know how sometimes, like if the document were Instagram post versus, I don't know, an email to your professor, they might contain different information. Might be about the same subject, but might contain different information. What is the general message of the document? What's it trying to say? What perspective does it represent? And what is the significance of the document? Why does it matter? Why is it important? Are there any weaknesses, strengths in the document? Is there something about the document that makes you trust it or distrust it, that sort of thing. I recognize, again, you're all going to be writing about the same thing, so your opinions could be similar. They can be different as well. Nobody should turn in the exact same paper. I assume the two would not. Also, you can list like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and answer the stuff that way, complete sentences, of course. Or you can make it like an essay, whatever makes you happy. I certainly have no preference, and I have not yet put up a sample, so maybe I'll do that tomorrow. Maybe there is a chance. I don't know that I would get to that today, but it is possible I will have a chance to do that tomorrow. Okay, so let's look at the document. Where's this? There it is. And then I'll show you what I did with the document that I didn't really mean to do. Why it keeps showing up small. You guys are in the way, trying to make it full size. How did you guys get in the way? There we go. When you're older, you got to make everything bigger. All right, so my goal was to give you some of the intro stuff, like this preface, and then for you to read about Cuba. So, yeah. So you can skip the Hispaniola part if you want, but there's not. Oh no, I did what I meant to do. It's just long. Okay, sorry. Ah, goodness. Yes, it's due a week from, yes, it's due a week from tomorrow. If you guys look on the Blackboard page, which you should do if you haven't, the due dates are listed there. And then on the assignments page, it tells you when it's due. So yeah. And on the, I think it's on the syllabus as well, there's a calendar section. Yeah, I'm not trying to fool with you. Yeah, it's just, you know, if we talk about everything the day before it's due, yeah, it's not good. So, all right. So here we have the De las Casas document. And okay, so it tells you the title isn't really the original title. That's good to know. And part of what ends up happening is other people will end up using this document to show that Spain was more evil than England. I think we talked about that as well. And excuse me, De las Casas' point in writing this was to make sure that the King of Spain and that the Pope also were aware, and the Prince Philip, were aware of the horrible things that were going on. So this is his introduction, and he's telling you that he was a priest. He definitely was not the Pope. That he was a priest and he'd been a friar. He was a Dominican. Mentioned some stuff that he had studied before, and talked about how he went overseas, running the hazards and danger by sea and the risk of a long voyage into Spain. So he ends up going back to Spain to talk to King Charles and Prince Philip to explain to them all of the terrible things that were going on back in the New World, in the Spanish New World. And so he has collected a combination of stories that he has either written himself or he has heard from other people, that he's gotten from affidavits. He also had training as a lawyer. So part of what he's doing is, he was a lawyer. He didn't like start law school and quit. I don't really know how law school worked back in the 1400s, but he was trained as a lawyer as well, which is not super uncommon to have training as a lawyer and then a priest, because it's what people in the upper class, all 5 of them, did during that time period. It's not more than 5, of course, but a really small percentage of the population. So he's an educated man from an educated class, discussing things with another educated man or two, potentially, from educated classes. So wanting to get his credentials in there. And of course, the king and the prince would have an idea who he was, because they had to agree to send certain people over to the New World. But so he is giving you his resume here, and he has collected stories, affidavits, that sort of thing, over a 50-year period to discuss what has happened in the Americas. And he wants to make sure that the king understands and the prince understands. He thinks the prince will be more open to his argument, but he wants to make sure they understand that what is going on in the Americas is going to harm the reputation of the Spanish and Catholics. So he wants to persuade, goodness, he's a wordy fellow, isn't he? He wants to persuade that he's telling the truth, that he's really just trying to be a reporter, is kind of what he's saying. But you'll notice as you read through here that he is doing more than just reporting. He's certainly making an argument, and he is fairly emotional about the argument. So, all right. Yeah, much of that first part is, it's the introduction, that sort of thing. And then you have him talking about when they first came over to the Americas and when they discovered it. He's got some discussion of how big it is, that sort of thing. And here's where he starts to talk about how nice the people are. And when you read through this section, or if you look through this section, you'll notice that he seems to describe the folks like they're kids, essentially, like really nice kids, really smart kids, but still sort of kids. They're really affectionate, they're simple, they're innocent, they are void of craft, subtlety, and malice. So they're not sneaking around, they're not lying to you. I just noticed how dark it is in the background here. That everything that they say is true. They're patient, they're submissive. Anything the Spanish ask them to do, they would just patiently do. They don't desire revenge. They're really kind of perfect. They're very nice people. They're subservient. They're just little sponges waiting for you to come, tell them about Jesus, tell them about, the ways of the Western world, to help explain to them how to become more civilized, that sort of thing. And then they talk about how simple their material culture is. When it says the men are pregnant and docile, he doesn't mean the men are pregnant, but that they're just ready to learn, that sort of thing. And then he starts talking about how the Spanish came in to slaughter the innocent sheep. And then the section where it begins to talk about Cuba, and the Hispaniola part's really short. It won't harm you to read that in any way. But the section where it starts to talk about Cuba, he's going to list some very specific things that the Spanish do that cause problems for the people in Cuba. So how they harm them, that sort of thing. Now, this whole book is about 100 pages, and you could read the whole book if you like. And I know you don't have time, but it will talk a lot about how the Spanish forced people into service, how the Spanish harmed the women, how the Spanish harmed the children. There's a section in there how they played, like they took all the babies and essentially played a game of catch with the babies, which of course is not going to end well. Talks about how sometimes the natives would rather kill themselves than have to suffer at the hands of the Spanish. And so the point of the excerpt and the entire book really is to tell you just how cruel the conquistadores were. And the goal that De las Casas has is to try to get the king and the Pope to denounce the conquistadores so that the behavior will change. Now, Las Casas is the priest, of course, and his goal is to convert people. He wants to convert the natives, and he wants to make sure they all go to heaven, that sort of thing, and that they get well versed in the ways of the church. but rather what he's seeing is a bunch of people that he feels that are pure and innocent and really open to conversion. But he feels like what is happening to them is that they're being tortured and harmed to the point where they would rather not even be with the Spanish, whether it's on earth or in the afterlife. So, and there's a discussion in this on the Isle of Cuba section where it talks about how they even say they'd rather go to hell than to heaven, because if the Spanish were in heaven, they don't want to be anywhere near them. So, kind of an interesting account. Now, what you've got to decide, and it'll be a little tricky, I suppose, is do you trust the account? Now, you've got to tell me what the account says, but you also have to tell me if you trust it or not. And there are reasons for you to trust it and reasons for you not to trust it, I would imagine. As far as things that you know, I mean, De las Casas is a well-known person. He has gathered evidence, which he says is accurate. He says that he has affidavits, so people have sworn that they're telling the truth. There's certainly other accounts from this time period by conquistadores themselves, and I think one of you was talking about something like that last time as well. And of course, Cortez is probably the most famous, at least from our perspective, Hernan Cortez, and he wrote about stuff that happened when he took over different places, and it's not dissimilar. But there are other accounts from the same time period that suggest that the conquistadores were pretty rough when they didn't get what they wanted, and sometimes just for effect. And the king and the prince didn't necessarily disbelieve what De las Casas was saying, but they did instead have to weigh, do we want the money that we're getting from this episode, from this exploration, or do we want to do what a priest tells us is the right thing? They're going to opt for the money. Eventually, the Pope is going to say, you know, what we're doing here is wrong, and he's going to denounce it, and then eventually denounce slavery in general. Now, if you read all of De las Casas' writings, I think I talked about it a little bit last time, what he will initially say is you shouldn't enslave the natives, you should enslave Africans instead. That makes more sense because they're less pure, less docile, less likely to be converted, that sort of thing. And then he's going to change his mind about that and said, you know what, we shouldn't enslave anyone because they're all children of God. We shouldn't enslave people, that sort of stuff. And that will become, not immediately, but that will become the official position of the Pope, which means it will become at a certain point the official position of Spain. But it takes a while. This is a part of that process, which is part of why it's important historically. And certainly there are other documents like this. I just realized I kept scrolling through there. I'm not trying to make you dizzy or drive you crazy, but there are other excerpts from this book that you could read if you wanted to. I put the link to the entire online version of the document if you want to read more of it. My guess is even if you did want to read more of it, you may or may not have time with the textbook and other things you need to do. And my goal here really on this one is just to share something that I don't know if you've read any of this before, but just to kind of let you know that a lot of the atrocities of the time period were known in certain quarters and certainly discussed. And what the people in charge of, whether they really could do something about those atrocities, they certainly could make orders to stop those atrocities. What they had to weigh was, do we want the reputation that we're going to gain from this atrocity more than we want the money that we are gaining? And what they decide initially is they really prefer the money. What they'll decide eventually is that they really would prefer not to have the reputation of the atrocity or the atrocity. And the reason that they'll decide that, or the reasons, of course, are varied. And it's going to depend on, who you talk to. I know you're not talking to anybody about this because, all these folks are deceased, but it's going to depend on what source you look at as to why it seemed important to stop some of this stuff. Now, there's some practical things. I mean, by the time they decide they're going to stop, they really have conquered most of the land they want to conquer. They also, you may remember from a previous history class, end up getting so much wealth in Spain that they cause this massive inflation that causes their economy to bankrupt, which is a really weird sort of problem for them to have. And at a certain point too, they end up expanding the empire so much that they don't have the personnel to control it. And you'll see that with the Spanish. You see it essentially with the English as well. It's part of why the United States was able to gain its independence. This document was not part of why the English expanding their territory dramatically. All right. So your goal, read this and answer those questions that we talked about. I'll try to put up a sample over the weekend so you can kind of look at it. And again, as one of you's already noted more than once, this is not due tomorrow. This is due next Friday. So the reason that I wanted to sort of present it a little bit today is to get you to start thinking about it just a little bit, okay? So it's better for you to plan ahead, start to think about what it is that you need to turn in. And so that way, if you have any questions, you have a chance to answer them. So think about this maybe a little bit over the weekend, maybe start to work on it a little bit if you have a chance, and then come back on Monday and see if you have any questions that you want to ask related to this. All right, stop sharing. All right, I'm gonna have to turn another light on. It's so dark in here, hang on. Must be the storm coming in, right? We'll see. All right. All right. So, and all of that, as I mentioned, is available on the Blackboard page. And the whole assignment is in one piece, it's not one document, it's two documents, but it's on the same page, is on the assignments page. And the separate pieces are available on the course documents page. So, all right then. And then we'll look at the question. Oh, sorry, wrong thing. The weekly, or the unit questions. Let me find this. There we go. All right. So unit questions. Compare Indian or indigenous society with that of Europeans. What differences were there, similarities? Be sure in your analysis to include in your analysis ideas about religion, land, gender roles as well, and notions of freedom. So that'll be one of the things we should probably discuss before we go today. And again, textbook, Blue Liberty. I think it'll be fairly straightforward if you look in the textbook. The sections are labeled, which is always helpful. And it talks about the different, pretty consistently talks about the different views of religion and land, that sort of thing, and how they viewed freedom, how that's different than how Christians viewed freedom. And Dr. Foner's consistent theme, as you've probably already noticed if you've looked at the book, or even the title of the book, Give Me Liberty, is how do different people view freedom at different times. So for you to have the discussion that you need to have either in the De las Casas question or in the textbook question about natives and Europeans, just be sure to look through the textbook. This really is designed for you to use the textbook. So the De las Casas stuff in your textbooks starts on page 27 or so. And then there's a pretty good discussion of the Spanish in the Americas, which might kind of help you as you work through that. And then when you're talking about the Europeans, you can make a distinction, and you should make a distinction between the different European groups. So this could be a fairly complicated answer in some ways, because you want to talk maybe a little bit about how the English did things versus how the French did things versus how the Spanish did things. At least those three groups, whether you talk about the Dutch or the Portuguese, no offense to the Dutch or the Portuguese, you may want to add that in, you may not. They talk pretty extensively in the textbook toward the end of the chapter about the Dutch, and it's because the Dutch are just so different. They are. Even their ideas of religious freedom, tolerance, that sort of thing are, their purpose in the Americas really was not to colonize. It was pretty strictly to trade. However, they founded a trading colony. And in that colony, there really are no requirements about religion. Women could own property. Women had certain civil rights as well. And if you read more European history from this time period, you'll also notice that you see more philosophical development and more theological development in the Netherlands, because there's just more freedom of thought and speech available, so people don't get in trouble for thinking differently about God, thinking differently about law, thinking differently about rights, that sort of thing. So you'll notice that the New Netherlands is probably going to be a little more tolerant than the other regions. And you may just keep that in mind for later if you don't discuss it in the question, because it's going to help you understand how the development in New York, what becomes New York, New Netherland at first, New Amsterdam, the city, and then New York, eventually the colony that is taken over by the English, how that is a little bit different, and why that society is a little different, and why it's a little more international, and why it's a little more tolerant. And some of that has to do with the Dutch background. Some of it has to do with it being a trade center. So people from all over the world are moving in and out. And also because it's a big city, that's more business based, it's less based on agriculture, even though most of the business does have something to do with agriculture. But it's it's an interesting settlement. I think you'll find it that way. All right, and I think we talked generally last time about how, when the Spanish come over, their goal really is to take over. They may allow the natives to continue to do what they do for a living and not really change any of that, but they want to take it over and reap the profits from it. And, they essentially show up and say, the land is ours now, and you work for us, keep doing the same thing, but give us the money. And we're in control now. And that, of course, is, and convert to Catholicism and speak some Spanish. So that doesn't go over very well. And they don't bring over families. They bring over primarily men, and they will intermarry. That's a very loose term for what they do. Sometimes it's consensual. It typically is not. So they will assault local women. Occasionally there's consensual marriage, but typically that's not how this goes. So there are going to be mixed race kids, either with the consent of the women or because of rape or assault. So population growth will accompany this in some ways. However, there's also lots of intentional destruction. So if there's resistance from the natives, the conquistadores just kill people. And we mentioned last time as well that there's definitely difficulty with resistance to European diseases. And you'll see that a lot with the Spanish colonies and with the English colonies, primarily because they bring over more people. Yeah, you see it less with the Dutch and less with the French because their purposes and their numbers are different. So the Spanish are pretty brutal and take over, cause intentional harm, some unintentional harm with diseases, and they're going to set up encomiendas. They're going to control the region and control the finances and require rents and payments and that sort of thing. So the Spanish are coming over and they want to control stuff and make a ridiculous amount of money and find gold. But they also, of course, have that religious element that doesn't seem to fit in well, which is why De las Casas writes so much and says we've got some contradictions here. With the English, at first you have exploration, but pretty quickly what you have is a bunch of people coming over that want to bring their families and get some land, because England's an agrarian society and they are going to make money through farming, and England is small. It has a lot of people and it's small. So the people who are coming over tend to be kind of upper class people, a lot of times, at least in the initial wave. And they think they're going to show up and maybe buy supplies and hire people, and it doesn't work so well because, there's no HB and there aren't people to hire. So they're going to end up being fairly dependent on trade with Native Americans in the early days, but as the numbers get larger and more people come over, they're going to start taking over quite a bit of the land from Native Americans. And that's going to create quite a bit of pressure. And it's also why the book talks quite a bit about how they viewed land. The natives think you live off the land as it is and, don't over harvest, that sort of thing. The English think that if you're not cutting down trees and planting stuff, that you're not doing what God has intended with the land, that you're lazy. So the English and the natives are going to view each other in dramatically different ways. And as well, and we'll talk about this more as we proceed through the unit, that different parts of the Americas are developed in different ways. The French come over primarily to trade, and they come over in smaller numbers. It's mostly men, not so many families. They don't want to take over a lot of the land. And typically they're viewed as more fair in trading, and the relationship between the French and the natives tends to be better. That's also why when there's the French and Indian War upcoming, that's why most of the natives, if they've got to pick between the French and the English, it's kind of a no-brainer. They pick the French. Unfortunately for them, the English win the war, but they pick the French because they feel like the French treat them better, and the French are less likely to take over their land. And they're more likely to assimilate with the natives rather than require the natives to assimilate to their customs. And the Dutch, it's about trade. Yeah, the Dutch come over in smaller numbers, produce a lot of wealth though. And because they're not very nationalistic, it's pretty easy for the English to take over their colony. So when you go through the unit, if you decide to do the first question, then what you would want to do is talk about the different European nations, at least the English, the French, and the Spanish, and how they dealt with natives, if there were dramatic differences in how they saw society. So talk about religion, land, gender roles, wealth, notion of freedom, that sort of thing. And you could do a section about each country, or you could do a section about religion, land, and gender roles and talk about it with the philosophy of the different countries. Just make sure you have an organizational strategy. Doesn't matter to me which one you have. And to reiterate, You have to choose one of these 4 questions. You don't have to choose the first one, okay? So one of these 4 questions, and the reason that we're talking about the first question today is because we're wrapping up the first chapter. And we'll probably, looking at the time, we probably will get into the second chapter a little bit. So, all right. You guys still with me? Everything good? I'm gonna assume everything's good. All right. Apparently I need to close those other documents, don't I? All right. Checking the chat. All right. Thanks for being with me. I appreciate it. Appreciate it. At least Brad's in. Good job. Okay. When I taught the high school kids last semester, what they would do is log on, and then I don't know what they would do, but not pay attention, maybe sleep, maybe work on calculus. I don't know what kids do. And then when class was over, they were still on. So they never logged off. So that was pretty weird. So I realized too, I mean, there are times that, if, like I said, if the kids are yelling, if the rain starts, if hit your leg against the chair and you have to say bad words, gotta go to the bathroom, that sort of thing. There are going to be times that you're not paying full attention. I get it, but they were never paying attention. It seemed like, oh my goodness. Oh, sorry for the yawn right in the middle, and the water. Trying to wake up drinking water. It's probably not why it's not working, is it? Okay. All right. So we talked about a lot of this stuff last time, so I don't want to go over the same stuff again, because how exciting would that be? All right. I know we talked about the Columbian Exchange, and we mentioned De las Casas. I think this is about where we stopped. So, and the book does, I told you, page 27, does talk about De las Casas, which will probably help you a little bit as you answer the document question for this unit. And he's a lawyer and priest, well-educated fellow, and he's often referred to as the priest of the Americas. And certainly he wasn't the only one here. There were thousands, literally, but his writing is the most prominent. And his work is chronicling 50 years of mistreatment of natives, and that's certainly the point of it. And the unfortunate side effect for him is the development of the Black legend, which I think that we mentioned last time. And the English are really fond of this because they can show that the Spanish are more cruel than they are. And you know from your study of world history that the Spanish and the French and the English are colonial rivals. They're rivals in pretty much everything for most of their history. And what they're doing during this time period is trying to show who is the best colonizer, which is sort of a funny thought, I would imagine, for most of us now. It's like, I don't know that there is a best colonizer. I assume that if you're the person that they're taking over, you don't like any of them. So, yeah. But they're trying to argue that they're more moral. And they're also going to argue that part of the reason they're more moral is their version of Christianity is more ethical and more accurate and more focused on what God would really want. And you've probably noticed too in your study of world history that when there are different religions that fight with each other, or different versions of religions, because we talked about how there's Catholic and not Catholic within Christianity, and certainly Catholics and not Catholics will fight with each other from time to time throughout history. But you also probably notice that occasionally Muslims and Christians had some problems with each other, and certainly people who follow Islam and people who follow Judaism are nations, I shouldn't say people necessarily, are going to have issues, and you'll probably notice that if you turn on the news at any point in modern times. But what you'll also notice if you look at it is it's very rarely about theology. I'm going to go with never, although that's probably too strong. We'll go back to very rarely about theology. It's usually about some sort of national interest or, political or economic concern. So the religion, the people who are arguing that they're fighting for their religion are not fighting for their religion as a rule. But you've noticed that. It's your religion is your official reason or your excuse, but it's something nationalistic or economic, or you want to gain territory, that sort of stuff. All right. I know all those things are intertwined. I know. Makes it complicated, doesn't it? All right. Another yawn. I'm so sorry. Goodness. Yeah, and this first chapter, you notice the first chapter is so kind of general that it's, yeah, okay. But let's wrap it up. I'm sorry. So Black legend, blaming the Catholic Church and Catholic nations, primarily Spain, for being cruel as they colonized, because we know the British were not, were not. Goodness. All right. And certainly there's evidence, and the book will note that the conquistadores plus de las Casas and other priests are going to keep journals, but also English colonists kept lots of journals as well. So, oh, goodness, I'm really not inspiring excitement today, am I? All right. French exploration of the New World. We talked about this. It's why there's French sounding things down the Mississippi River. So primarily in Canada and along the Mississippi River, smaller numbers of folks, mostly focused on trade. And the French priests were much more likely to adapt to native cultures to help convert and also use the vernacular. Yeah, vernacular. They were way ahead of Vatican II, weren't they? Some of you are like, why is she even talking about Vatican II? But they were much more likely to try to adapt the religion to the language of the natives rather than force the natives to learn Latin so that they could enjoy Mass. So there you go. All right, and natives tend to like trading with the French. Yep. And the Dutch are their own folks. They're not nationalistic at all. They're just about cash. And I think they sort of give that Wall Street kind of feeling. So I think, when you look at modern day New York City and you think about trade and stocks and that sort of thing, it sort of makes sense maybe to tie it to the Dutch, who really, they're trying to make money. I mean, that's their goal. And that's a fairly straightforward thing. They're not trying to convert folks. They're not trying to make you be Dutch. You don't have to fly an orange flag. They just want to trade with you. So their settlement is New Netherland, present day New York, and the major city would be New Amsterdam, which is present day New York City. So not nationalistic, no major military presence, which is part of the reason that they don't maintain their colony. And the book spends 3 or 4 pages talking about how they viewed rights dramatically differently. Certainly it's going to be the only major European society in that era that gives women rights, gives women property rights, gives them legal rights, that sort of thing. And when the English take over that colony, there's going to be some insistence among the Dutch that some of those rights remain. So New England, or excuse me, why do I keep saying New England? New Netherlands, very unique colony. And because of that background, it's going to make New York a little bit different as well when it becomes a colony, a British colony, and then eventually a state. All right, I feel like that's probably enough for chapter 1. We're not leaving, don't get excited. I know I was telling somebody, it's like, I know my class feels really bad that the first 2 classes were too short. They feel like they're not getting their money's worth. And my friend just laughed. She said, no, they don't feel bad about it. It's like, yeah, I know, I was just kidding. You should feel bad about it though. You paid for this class. I know. I don't mean to cheat you out of anything. All right. Is there anything you guys want to ask about the first chapter? I think the first chapter is just the, hey, here's a whole bunch of stuff that happened, colonization. It's pretty generic sort of stuff, probably stuff you already know, but maybe reminders of some things that you haven't thought about in a while. And I remember at least one of you has a really extensive knowledge of the Spanish in the New World, and that was quite impressive. So good job. All right, let's go on then. All right, I'm checking the chat. Oh, goals for exploration for New England and New Spain. I guess in some ways they're kind of similar. They want to control land. Um, and New England is probably, they are probably more likely to send families over so that they can start their own farms. New Spain is not bringing families over. They're going to take over everybody else's farms and say like, hey, these are ours now, and you owe us part of the crop. So, I mean, that may be, and of course, where they are is different. Now, where the Spanish end up, they are going to look more for, they're going to be more successful at finding gold. The English did come over hoping for gold. There's just no gold, so they weren't very successful at finding gold. Much more successful for the Spanish. As far as Native American response, at first for both colonial groups, it seemed that the Native Americans were kind of curious, willing to trade, that sort of thing. And when the numbers were small, more true with the English because they started in smaller numbers. The Spanish started with pretty large numbers and pretty hostile groups of folks. They brought the military initially. You don't see that with the English. That's not exactly how that works with the English colonization. English colonization is really more smaller groups of folks. Occasionally, like some of them are royal colonies and they're started by like Sir Walter Raleigh, somebody like that. So it's a small group of people that are commissioned by the government. With the Spanish, it's literally the government coming over and they're sending like, here's the army, here are the priests, and you guys go in and take over and, control the land for us. So the natives are going to be more hostile to the Spanish more quickly, but also the Spanish come over and they're more hostile pretty initially. And you've probably read some time ago, back when you were kids, some of you, a couple of you might still be kind of kids, but most of you are, grown. But back, say, 8th grade-ish or maybe 6th grade, when you were reading about the cultures in that area, the Aztecs had some prophecies that around the time the Spanish were to arrive, that there was going to be some huge disruption and a god would arrive and kind of change how they lived within the world. And that's when Cortez came. And I guess in that same year, they had some disruptions in weather patterns. They had flooding and they had really bad storms and they had an earthquake. So there were a lot of unusual geographic and weather related issues. Then Cortez shows up and the prophets had suggested that whoever showed up that would be a god, yeah, good luck on the storm thing. But whoever showed up that would be a god would look a certain way, that it would be pale, kind of pale, and he would gleam, that sort of thing. And I guess Cortez was a fairly white Spanish dude, and as lots of Spanish dudes are, and wore the armor. So the armor made it seem as though, he was glowing, that kind of thing. So he sort of fits some of the prophecies of the time period. So they thought that he was a god. And of course, he's going to take advantage of that, as you would expect someone to do. And by the time they figured out that he wasn't, he'd really taken over a lot of their political structure as well. So, he was a god, he demanded tribute, and they gave it to him. By the time they figured out that he wasn't the result of their prophesied leader, it was kind of too late. And his military or his troops had come in and killed lots of the ruling families. So I think one of the things that gave the Spanish quite an advantage there is that they were overwhelmed by the technology the natives were overwhelmed by the Spanish military technology, the metal and the weapons, that sort of thing. Plus, they believed that the Spanish were the fulfillment of some prophecy, and there were lots of other disruptions seemingly going on during that time period. Are you? I know a couple of you have already noted that you're starting to have some weather-related trouble, and I'm looking around. It's like, oh man, it's really dark here. So, yeah, if you guys end up getting cut off or something, I know you don't control anything. Yeah, like weather-related power, that sort of thing. So do your best. I got it. All right. I don't know if that was very helpful about the difference in the English and the Spanish. And the English they show up usually in smaller groups, and those groups have agreements among themselves about what they're going to do. They're usually smaller. They're not, they don't have the military with them. So they're going to have to figure out how to get along with the natives a little better. But you still see a pretty substantial loss of life in some of the larger interactions between the English and the natives, not most likely, definitely because of smallpox and influenza, that sort of thing. So, all right. Let me close the chat. All right, so let's start talking about chapter 2. You ready? You good? Everything's fine? Okay. So because it's a U.S. history class, we're going to talk quite a bit more about the English than the French and the Spanish and the Dutch and the Portuguese. Did we even mention the Portuguese? Do we even care about the Portuguese? Oh, goodness. It says U.S. history class. You probably noticed that the Portuguese Treaty of Tordesillas, we mentioned that last time, that they take over mostly Brazil and some islands off of Brazil. We do, of course, care about the Portuguese, of course. So, all right. Yeah, I know the weather is messy. And, if it ends up the most, you just do what you can. If you have to go or, you lose power or internet, not your fault. I get it. No problem at all. All right. It's just like you receiving, colonization from, no, it's not a good analogy at all. All right. So Portuguese, we do like them because they develop a lot of the navigation techniques. And then after that, we just really don't care about the Portuguese. Certainly, if you notice, like if you read more about colonization during that time period, European colonization, most of the slaves initially who come to the New World go to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies where they're producing primarily sugar. So you end up with lots and lots of slaves in that region, which is why De las Casas is writing so much about slavery. The slavery in the United States what becomes the United States comes a little bit later, not dramatically, but a little bit later. And of course, initially, poorer English folks come over as indentured servants, and we'll talk about that pretty quick. Yeah, okay. All right, beginnings of English America. So they're talking 1607 to 1660. And the book will also mention that it's a rough thing to say, but it's true, that the way that the English colonized the New World is really sort of, they practiced on how they messed with Ireland. And there's a lot of truth to that. They sent troops to Ireland. They sent settlers to Ireland who controlled the land and also controlled the government in Ireland. And you'll end up with the fighting between the Catholic, more indigenous population of Ireland and the Church of England controlled English, Scottish folks that were sent to Ireland to civilize that country. And there's still some conflict. When I was a kid a million years ago, I was born in the late 60s, the middle of the 60s. And terrorists, like in our movies in the early 70s, all the terrorists were Irish, and there was a reason for that. So Ireland and England had a really rough history with each other, and that really continued through the 70s. It gets resolved more in the 80s and 90s, and then it really, the violent part of it mostly stops in the 21st century. There's, a few episodes, but this is a long-standing feud is what is the point I'm trying to make. I don't know if I'm making it well. All right. So England harassed Ireland, more than harassed Ireland. Uh, and many times historians refer to that as sort of practice for what they're going to do when they go overseas. Now, if you're wondering why does England start colonizing during this time period, it's because they stopped fighting with themselves. And you'll notice when you look at the history of colonization, that countries don't colonize until they have decent military, and until whatever internal large, oh, there's the thunder, large internal strife is solved. So if you're having civil war, civil conflict, that sort of thing, that's typically good for your neighbors because you're not going to bother them as much. Sometimes once you solve those civil conflicts, those internal conflicts, that's when it becomes sort of a problem for the neighbors, because then you've probably increased your military some in that process, and now you've got a pretty strong military and you're ready to use it outside of your country. So the English issues that needed to be resolved before colonization could start were religious, sort of religious in the way that we talked about before. I mean, I don't know, I don't know how you guys view religion at all, if you view religion, but when I think of religious people, I see them differently than religious institutions, because you think of your grandmother maybe, who prayed a lot and read her Bible and that sort of stuff, and your grandma was pretty harmless, mostly, and unless she was mad at you, and she prayed about stuff and she gave people cookies and she was nice to everybody, that sort of stuff. To me, because I had that grandmother who was just pure and lovely to everyone she ever met, no matter who they were, what their back. She was just my grandmother, almost perfect. So in my brain, that's religious people, my grandmother. Church, sometimes church is nice, like, hey, we want to help the poor and give food to the homeless and slavery. But sometimes church is, I want to get involved in politics. So church as an institution, and certainly church, the Catholic Church, or initial Christianity, the Holy Roman Empire, is that combination of church and state, which is such a mess that it's hard to separate church and state, which is why there's so much insistence in more modern countries that there be a separation of church and state because of what we've seen in the past, because the church will corrupt, the state will corrupt the church, and then the church sometimes will dominate the state, and it's problematic. So when the Catholics and Protestants are fighting in England, what I'm trying to say is they're probably, it's not a theological problem. Now, it may have started as a theological problem, but it's become a political problem. It's become an economic dispute. It's about who's going to control the politics and the money of the country. So you probably know that the Church of England was started for very religious reasons, because Henry VIII wanted a divorce, and the Catholic Church was, let's see, it was Catherine of Aragon, I think, was the one that he wanted to divorce, and her family was really big in the Catholic Church, so they weren't going to allow for that divorce. So Henry VIII couldn't get a divorce, so he said, you know what, there are problems within the Catholic Church doctrinally, so we're going to start the Church of England. And he was going to be the head of the Church of England, and he gave himself a divorce. So there you go. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't people within England who had theological disputes with the Catholic Church. They were very similar to Martin Luther's disputes, concerns over indulgences, concerns over what you see a lot in the Church of England initially is concerns over the authority, how is the authority of the Pope derived? And if you study the Holy Roman Empire, dang, that is a confusing thing. Sometimes the head of the church is in France, there's a competing head of the church in Italy, and none of those competitions have anything to do with theology. So all of this stuff gets fairly complicated. And the Church of England is saying, look, we don't think any of this has to do with the theologians in the Church of England. Their concern is that neither one of those, the French Pope or the Italian Pope, really are the true head of the church, and that the scriptures are not being properly interpreted, and that the Catholic hierarchy has too much spiritual power, but political power, how forgiveness is decided, that sort of thing, who decides what a penance is, and that leads to that discussion of indulgences again. So there are legitimate theological concerns, but Henry VIII doesn't really have them. So what ends up happening then is the people who follow Catholicism and the people who follow the Church of England are going to fight, and there are different factions within the different royal families that are going to fight with each other. What will eventually happen is that Queen Elizabeth, when she begins her reign, says, look, you want to be Catholic, that is cool. Be Catholic. The state will not harass you. You go be as Catholic as you like. We will leave you alone. But what had happened before is, like when Henry VIII was king, he persecuted the Catholic Church. When, oh goodness, was it? I really lose track of the kings and queens because I really am a US historian. I know I should know more about this stuff. I had a friend that taught world history that would always get upset with me because I go like, look, I just don't care. I can't remember them all. But Mary, yeah, Queen Mary was certainly much more entrenched with the Catholic Church. So when she's in charge, she's going to oppress Protestants. What Queen Elizabeth does is say, look, we're going to stop oppressing whichever religious group we don't like. So if you want to be Catholic, cool, be Catholic. It's not the official church of the state, but we're not going to stop you from doing that. Nobody's going to oppress you for that. Now, if you're wondering how far does this religious tolerance go, it doesn't go very far. You mostly need to be Catholic or Protestant. There are times within certain European countries that they're not going to harass you if you're Jewish. There are very few times that they're not going to harass you if you're Muslim. And then if there are religions beyond that, they're not aware of, I know that there are religions beyond that, but certainly those are not officially practiced in European countries during this time period. So England's going to solidify under the Church of England during the Queen Elizabeth's reign, and that unity is going to allow them to start focusing on other things like exploration and then colonization. So energy and resources that the government had used to promote one religion over another, that energy and those resources are now going to be used for exploration. Plus, they're trying to keep up with the colonial pursuits that they're seeing in the Netherlands and Spain and France as well. So, yeah. No, I really do I know the thunder's starting here too as well. So I probably won't go on much longer. I know a lot of you are starting to be concerned about, losing your connection, that sort of thing. So I'll stop pretty soon. But if you end up having, if you get cut out, you get cut out, and don't worry about it. You can always go back and check the recording if you like. I don't know if you noticed in the syllabus, I know we talked about it the first day, there's a YouTube link or channel. So if you check that, that's where I put the recordings each day. I won't probably tell you the link to each day's recording, but they're listed if you go to that channel. So you need to see stuff, it's there. And that way too, like if we talked about a question and you thought, oh my goodness, what did she say? What page number did she say? You can go back and look, and you can just kind of fast forward to when you see the notes on the screen that you need to hear about. Okay. All right, so we'll go through a little bit of this, and then I know you guys are nervous about the storm and the connections and stuff. All right, so England solidifies under the Church of England during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Then they start to focus on exploration so they can keep up with the neighbors. And some people will leave the country as well because they either feel like their religion isn't being respected, recognized, and certainly there are times that Puritans are going to be harassed by the government of England, and as you know, there are times that the Puritans get control of the government of England, and then they harass other people. But there are going to be times where the Puritans are going to come to the Americas for religious freedom. Now, they don't want you to have religious freedom; they want to have their own religious freedom, and they want everyone else. Oh, sorry for the yawn. They want everyone else to be a Puritan. And Quakers, there's just Quakers, they love everyone, and everyone has God within them, and you don't have to read the Bible every day. God tells you what to do. So as long as you listen to God, you're good. So Quakers are going to be very accepting of everyone, and they're seen as really unusual in the English society. So a lot of times they leave so they don't get harassed very much by more mainstream religious groups. Now, all of these people follow or fall into that umbrella of Christianity on the Protestant side. So when there's issues, like the Puritans are going to have issues with the Church of England. This is where students always say, the Puritans got angry with the Pope. The Puritans no, they don't care about the Pope. The Puritans are angry with the Church of England because they think it's become too materialistic and because it's too focused on rituals and icons and things like that. We'll talk about Puritans later. I'm not going to have a whole Puritan talk today. That'll be for Monday. That's something to look forward to, right? Okay. And the Quakers, they just don't have any formal, they don't even necessarily have a preacher because God can talk to anybody, God may give a little kid the message for the day. So yeah, Quakers are very different, and they're going to get harassed a lot. I know, it's terrible. It's not a good analogy at all, but I would always tell the high school students, the Quakers are sort of the Buddhists of Christianity. And they go like, no, that makes no sense at all. I'm just saying they're pacifist and peaceful and accepting of stuff. And all right, going on, terrible now. All right, so once the religious difficulty is solved, except for a little bit of trouble for the Quakers and the Puritans, who are both pretty small minority groups, there's a lot of unity within the country, and the people who come to the Americas for religious freedom are people in these smaller groups that feel like they're getting harassed back in England. If you're wondering, are most people, part of a certain church when they come over from England? Yeah, I mean, yes. So most of the colonists will be sort of officially part of the Church of England. And one of the things that you'll notice is they don't really proselytize. You're going, of course they don't. Use the words we use. Okay, they don't try to convert you. So yeah, Church of England guys are not going to come knock on your door and say like, hey, you need to go to church with me. Or, here's a pamphlet about the real God. They don't do that. Their assumption is you'll just come to church because you're supposed to, and that's what people did. Also, Puritans are not going to try to convert people because they believe that God's already called a certain group of them. And if God hasn't called you, they really don't want you there. So these are not groups of people that come over and then try to spread their religion. So that makes them a little different. Quakers will try to spread their religion, but they're kind of peaceful in how they do it. So they're not really, hard hitting kind of, yeah. Okay. People come over for economic opportunity in the Americas. I would suggest to you that this is probably the biggest reason that people come over. I'm not trying to discount religion. No. Especially, in the middle of the country where we really like religion more than the sides of the country, I think. But economic opportunity, that's a thing. Okay, so England is small. There's not so much land. And there's a lot of people. They've had a really big population increase. So if you want to get land, it's just not possible at this point. They practice something called, excuse me, I'm not clearing my throat because I'm about to say a bad word. I blame the rain. All right, so primogeniture and entail. So this is how they decide who is going to inherit certain things. Primogeniture is the idea that the firstborn son is going to inherit the landed estate. So typically families with money have a lot of land. And if they divide that land between, several different kids, then that land is going to lose its value. So firstborn son gets the land. Everybody else maybe gets some money, something like that. But with that money, it's really hard to buy land because there's no more land. Yeah. If you live do you live in Leander? And if you live in Leander, dang, we've got a problem with that right now because, people are moving here because it's amazing. And if you wanted to buy a house here right now, crud, it's going to be hard. But it's true. I know it's true in the entire area. I know it's not unique to Leander at all. But in the Austin area, we're all kind of in that spot, aren't we? So, but here you might want to buy the land. There's just none to buy. So those firstborn sons get all the landed estate. The secondborn sons maybe get some money. So those guys are probably going to come to the Americas because they see it as their only chance to buy land. Yeah, that's why you guys are moving. Oh, somebody's selling their house. It's why you guys are moving to Florence or Elgin or wherever you're moving, hoping that maybe you can afford a house or something. I don't know, man. But yeah, they had kind of similar issues, but they had to go overseas. So, wow. National population increased really dramatically in 50 years. So colonizing North America is seen as a safety valve for excess population. Also, undesirable people or broke people needed a new place to be. Now, if you didn't decide you were undesirable, society decided it. So there are going to be people maybe in jail that are going to get pushed to the Americas. They're going to get sentenced to the New World. And sometimes they choose, sometimes if they're in prison for debt, they can't get out of prison, debtor's prison, until they pay off that debt. Well, you can't make any money in prison. So if you go into prison for debt, you could be there a very, very long time. And also the fact that you're in prison means that you're not contributing to the household income. So your family is not going to be able to get you out either. It's probably going to cause them additional problems. So sometimes your debtor will allow you, especially if they end up going to the New World, they will pay your passage over if you agree to serve them for a certain number of years, typically 5 to 7. And if it's not your debtor, there might be someone else that will pay off your debt if you'll agree to go to the New World and serve them. So indentured servitude, it's typically 5 to 7 years. These are poor folks, primarily men in England, who are paying off debt. They'll never get out of prison until the debt is paid off. So they see this really as their only hope of life outside of prison. if you're wondering, is this a good job? No, it's terrible. I know I'm hearing the thunder as well. Some of you go, I bet you're going like, it's about to hit. So the indentured servitude thing, it's a bad deal. You've got to work 5 to 7 years. People are not going to protect you. There's not going to be law enforcement that makes sure that whoever your boss is doesn't mistreat you. It will decrease your lifespan probably by somewhere between 5 to 10 years in an era where you're probably only going to live into your 40s anyway. You get punished a lot. You probably can't marry until your period of indenture is over. You're promised freedom, which you'll get, a freedom payment, which could be land or money, which you may or may not get. But the freedom part really mattered because if you stayed in the debtor's prison, you were never going to get out. So this is your probably single opportunity to get out of debtor's prison. And again, it's primarily men because the one bonus of not having very many rights as a woman is you probably can't accrue a whole lot of debt. That's about the only bonus. There were some women who served as indentured servants, and maybe that was just for some sort of unique opportunity that wouldn't be available to them in England. Oftentimes, they ended up essentially as sex slaves, or prostitutes. And that was not their intention. They thought they were going to go over to cook and clean, take care of somebody's kids. But once you got over to the Americas, again, no protection. So it's a fairly difficult thing. And not very many female indentured servants, primarily men. And you'll see, we'll talk about this next time. A lot of times when they were treated poorly, when they gained their freedom, they might try to rebel against the ruling class. We'll see that sometime. And then interactions with natives. And we'll stop after this because I know several of you have sent messages that you're losing connection, that sort of thing. So interactions with natives. Most notable exception of intermarriage is John Rolfe and Pocahontas. And I know that's really distressing because you need it to be John Smith and Pocahontas, but it's not. So there you go. That marriage was probably not a marriage of love. That was a marriage, it was like a financial merger. And that's not uncommon during this era. It's honestly probably not uncommon during our current era for people who are wealthy. So John Rolfe was the wealthiest tobacco planter in Virginia, in the colony, and Pocahontas was the daughter of the most prominent Native American leader during that time period. So this marriage was really as much about promoting trade as it was about other stuff. So Rolfe is older. I think he's probably about 40. Pocahontas is teen-ish. And that wouldn't be necessarily super uncommon during that time period for a variety of reasons. Men lived longer during that time period for not a variety of reasons. For really one, childbirth. Childbirth is dangerous stuff, especially then. Now it's mostly just painful stuff, but I mean, you can read statistics as well. Medical statistics, still there are issues with women's health and baby's health in childbirth, but I know it's a natural process, but it's a dangerous process. So women tended to live much shorter lives during that time period. Yeah, she was kiddish. She was, for sure. I think when she met John Smith, she was 12. And they were friends, apparently, and by friends, I don't mean anything other than friends. There was no sneaky stuff going on there. But apparently those two did kind of like each other and have a friendship. When she married John Rolfe, she stopped communicating with John Smith, which would have been typical for the time period. You didn't talk to, once you were married. Honestly, before you were married, in English culture, you wouldn't talk to a man unless you had a male from your family present. But, Pocahontas, it's not English culture. One of the things she does do is convert to Christianity, Church of England, and what is her name after that? I can't remember. I want to say Isabella, but I don't think that's right. Um, but she converts, changes her name, and then goes on a tour in England so they can show off how cool she is. Then she gets smallpox and dies. So it's not a very romantic story at all. The John Rolfe and John Smith thing in the cartoon is much better for sure. But this intermarriage did produce a child, and it's really like a financial merger in some ways. But it was pretty unusual for English colonists and natives to intermarry. You saw that more with the French, more consensually and less consensually with the Spanish. Although, as time goes along, you'll see things become much more consensual between Spanish and natives. And also, what's always true is all of these rules about marriage, they really don't apply to poor people. No one cares at all what poor people do. So if you're a poor dude, and maybe you finished your period of indenture and you found a native woman and she was okay with you, if you got married, no one cared. Yeah, because you're a poor dude. Yeah, I don't think John Rolfe's a good guy at all either. When his wife, when Pocahontas, I can't remember if her name was Isabella. I don't know why I keep thinking that. But when she died, he just gave the kid to one of his relatives and said, "Here, you raise the kid." Now that's not super uncommon for dudes during that time period either. Although typically they just married another woman really quickly to help raise their kids. It's also really uncommon in this era, by the time you become an adult, for you to have both your birth parents, your original parents, alive. It's really unusual. Yeah. And it's usually your mom goes first, but after, dad has remarried 2 or 3 times and then dad dies, it's like, oh man, I don't even know who I'm related to anymore. But so much of that is because of danger, in life in general, leading to short lifespans, and then of course the danger of childbirth, which cannot really be overstated during this time period. All right, so intermarriage is unusual, especially in people who are middle and upper class. And if you're looking for middle class, there's not a whole lot of that during this time period. That's the one things the Puritans will bring to us, is the middle class. I'll try to persuade you over the next couple of days that Puritans are not all terrible. I know you're going to go like, but Salem witch trials. It's like, yeah, I know, but yeah, that was just Salem. There weren't that many people there, right? Okay, so Pocahontas is our big example. Sorry for the yawn. Of intermarriage, but it's pretty unusual. English initially desired trade, and then eventually, nope, we're taking over the land. So their thought will quickly be the natives need to be displaced, relocated farther west because the English wanted the land near the coast. And then as more and more English folks come, more and more natives are pushed farther west. And the pushing is not a gentle push. They're definitely going to fight back. And there'll be lots and lots of conflict about this. So English will take the land, push natives farther west, but it's filled with conflict. Traders, missionaries, colonial authorities all sought to change the culture and environment because they needed to fix the Native Americans. They thought the Native Americans were worth fixing, but they didn't think that they needed to stay the same. They thought that to civilize Native Americans, at the very least, they had to convert to Christianity, and they also needed to wear more clothes. They're very distressed sometimes that the natives don't wear a lot of clothing. So that seems to bother them quite a bit. All right, I don't want to go on too much for a variety of reasons, some weather related, others who knows why. But I do want to give you a chance at least to read chapter 2 before I talk about it very much more. And that's kind of a general sort of overview. Plus, this gives you a chance to go retreat from floodwaters and not worry too much about getting cut off from the internet. So let me go ahead and stop the recording. Who knows, maybe next week